good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're calling in from, although it's noon on the West Coast, so hopefully everybody's in the afternoon hours here. Thank you for joining us for today's Panelcast, Migrating to the Cloud. And we are joined today by Zerto, Datrium, Iland, and Druva, and we'll be introducing our panel shortly. So our topic today is what you need to know when you're considering migrating applications or workloads to the cloud. And we're going to be answering a whole lot of really great questions from the audience today that came in during the registration process. And I'll do introductions of our panel shortly. My name is Scott Lowe. I'll be your moderator for today's panel. If you have additional questions that we have not answered yet in the presentation, we urge you to use the questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. We would love to answer your questions live, and we will answer them live, assuming that they pertain to the topic at hand. At the end of the event, we'll be giving away 3 $100 Amazon gift cards. Our panelists today are a very talented group. We're joined by Sam Woodcock, who is Senior Director of Cloud Strategy from Iland. Sam, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Sazzala Reddy, who is CTO and co-founder of Datrium. Sazzala, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody.
We have Steve Blow, who is a technology evangelist with Zerto. Steve, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And finally, we have Curtis Preston, the Chief Technologist of Druva. Curtis, thank you for being here today as well.
Anytime.
So normally in our Panelcast events, this is where I jump in and do a short level setting of what we're going to be talking about. We have so many great questions that came in that I'm going to skip that today, and we're going to jump right into the questions for the event. And again, if you have questions, please make sure that you ask them in the GoToWebinar control panel. And also, during the event, notice that if in the handouts pane in the GoToWebinar control panel, there are a number of handouts from today's great vendors. So without further ado, let's get to our first question. So this is a basic one, guys. I think it's one that is important for people to understand. And the question is, what is the difference between the hybrid cloud and the multi-cloud? Steve, do you want to start today's discussion?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I guess what we're seeing now is a plethora of new cloud platforms arriving. We've also got, I guess, a lot of condensing at the same time. But what we have historically in the industry is obviously an on-premises deployment. We've now got these cloud platforms. Essentially, the multi-cloud platform is where you're looking to adopt multiple cloud platforms. You then have the hybrid cloud platform where maybe all of your workloads don't necessarily fit on one of these cloud platforms. And in those scenarios, then you can maybe have some on-premises environments still, where you have some of your architecture that's maybe got different compliancy requirements, different performance requirements. Maybe the cloud platforms that you've chosen aren't able to deliver. And that's typically where the hybrid cloud piece comes in.
What about you, Sam? I mean, Iland is obviously doing a lot with the cloud these days. What are your thoughts on this? What people need to understand is the difference between these terms.
Yeah, certainly. So obviously, Iland is a cloud provider. We run our own cloud platform in 9 different locations. But for us, I think what this concept is really about finding the right place for your workload and application. We really feel that we address a good space from our perspective, but there's other environments that are being considered for different use cases. You might want to run those cloud native applications in one of the hyperscale environments. For us, we really fit a need of running VMware-based workloads, protecting VMware-based workloads. And for us, multi-cloud and hybrid cloud. Multi-cloud is about finding the right place for your workload, and that can be in a variety of different places. You have workloads across those different environments. And for us, it's about connecting those services together. And from a hybrid cloud perspective, it's really around maybe running on premises, maybe that fits the need there, and tying that into a cloud environment that fits for the purpose that you're looking for.
Sazzala, from Datrium's perspective and from your perspective, when you think about this term, what does it mean to you?
So hybrid cloud, generally, when I hear that word, what people are thinking about it as a DR strategy for, they have on-prem, and they want to use the cloud as a DR strategy. If you look at the top #1 use case for hybrid cloud, is DR. That's how people think about it. When you say multi-cloud, so there was a time, like in the recent past, where people kind of were moving their workloads to the cloud, but we are now in the place of multi-cloud 2.0. What that means is that it's not about on-prem, it's not about cloud, it's basically about treating everything as a commodity and basically being able to run your workloads anywhere. So cloud is a commodity, kind of let's use it that way, is the mindset of the multi-cloud.
Okay. Curtis, you have any thoughts on this?
Just real quick, the way I see it is one, multi-cloud goes sideways and hybrid cloud goes vertically, right? So multi-cloud is, I'm going to actually run a workload or some workloads in AWS, Azure, maybe some in Iland. And that hybrid cloud, I'm going to run some workloads here and some workloads up in a cloud provider. So one, that's, to me, hybrid cloud is going vertical and multi-cloud is going sideways.
That's a good way to look at it. I like that, actually. That's an interesting take. And in either one of these, the on-premises environment is still a part of the discussion. I mean, that's one of the things that strikes me. I think people need to keep in mind is, as they're considering migrating to the cloud, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to just dump everything there. And we'll talk more about that with other questions as we get into it today. This is a long question, so give me a second here. So this is the proof, the thing we always have to bring to people, right? Sometimes we have to prove to stakeholders that it's a good idea to do this in the first place, basically. What are the common first steps that you see people taking to move to the cloud before they simply just start migrating a bunch of stuff? And Sam, given what your background is, why don't you take this one first?
Yeah, we see a lot of cloud migrations at Iland. I think for us, it's really about, first of all, identifying what's the reason that you're moving to the cloud. What benefits are you going to get from both a technical and a business perspective towards moving to that cloud environment? It's first really important to identify that, because then you can decide really where the best place to house that data would be. And so when you're considering moving to the cloud, I think before taking the first step to move everything, you really need to utilize technologies around migration to start with maybe some of the less critical applications. Actually, what we often find is disaster recovery as a service, which is our key competency at Iland, is a really nice first step to actually be able to take a copy of your production applications, move them into a cloud environment, and you've actually got a non-intrusive way to get those there. And then you can validate the things that you need to actually build confidence in that plan. How do they perform? What level of security have you got there? What's the support experience like? How long is that process going to take? So it's really about, I think, validation and ensuring that that move is going to give you what you want before then taking the next step towards bringing everything online in the cloud. That's what we see. And we have generally a lot of process around making sure that that's defined ahead of time so that really customers get the success that they need.
Sazzala, what are your thoughts on this question? The first thing that people should be thinking about as they consider cloud migrations?
Yeah, I think like every business has three things. Talking to CIO, it's I think what Sam said a little bit is that it's about the why are we moving to the cloud? Is it speed up business? Is it going to improve my speed up business? Is it going to fit my budget? Ultimately, it has to fit the budget. You can't move to the cloud because it's cool. And thirdly, I think it has to be risk mitigation. Like if I move there, will I change? Will my business fall apart? Those are the three people think. So in that aspect, DR is actually maybe the first step you could just take and try it out. Like do DR testing, automate it. For example, VMware Cloud is now available on Amazon. You could use that because if you have the VMware environments, you can easily migrate it to the VMware Cloud, and that's probably the first step because it doesn't change anything in terms of your scripting, in terms of your fundamental architecture. It does cost more, but I think it's a good attempt to actually try it out and see how that goes. And then if you have non-virtualized workloads like Kubernetes, then that's a different game. That's a different strategy and how you apply there. I think it's a longer topic for that. But generally, I think using VMware Cloud is actually not a bad idea. Just start it off.
Curtis.
Yeah, I think I'm going to start with what Sam said, which is you need to know what it is, what problem you're trying to solve, right? So the common one that you hear people say is that they're gonna save all this money by moving to the cloud, and in many cases that is not going to be the case, depending on what you do, right? Now, but if your problem is that you've decided that your company is horrible at managing hardware and you want to stop managing hardware and just manage all VMs, then it's a simple thing to move to the cloud, right? But it's find out take a small workload. A lot of people are suggesting DR and backup. Obviously, we're a data protection company. We would agree with that. But it's for a lot of people, it's a natural thing that they can move to the cloud, because I would argue that DR and backup is one of those things where it really takes advantage of the temporary nature of the cloud, right? So if you have your systems ready to go in a DR, but you don't actually pay for them until you spin them up, that is a perfect way to use the cloud and where you can actually save money, right? But I would object to the final part of the question where it says before migrating everything. very few companies are able to migrate everything to the cloud. And I would argue that maybe they shouldn't, right? That not every workload is appropriate for the cloud.
I would agree with that. In fact, you know, as I've talked to people and seen a lot of things, you know, for myself, there's been, if you look over the last few years, there was a lot of push to go to the public cloud early on, and people, I mean, I've talked to a number of companies, they decided to go all in, and then it got to a point where it was like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't have done that. And they're pulling some things back where it makes sense. So there needs to be, I think one of the first things we need to do is a really comprehensive workload analysis and determine, what is it really costing me to run this here? What do I think it'll cost me in the cloud? Is it going to operate well? All that kind of stuff. I mean, it's. I don't think it's just a you know, dump everything there, as you mentioned, Curtis. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think well, you've raised some good points yourself there, but exactly what Curtis said. The benefits of the cloud are the flexibility and the scale. So being able to replicate data into the cloud for use in the event of a disaster scenario, but actually not paying for any compute costs until that disaster scenario is massively cost effective. You think historically people have had on-premise hardware sat there either doing another task, but ultimately there for DR, disaster recovery DR, in the event of a situation. That's very costly. Having the ability to just utilize storage in one of these cloud platforms is very beneficial. Equally, if you're backing up into the cloud platforms utilizing their storage capabilities, the scale piece there is really critical. You know, again, when you're looking at physical hardware, there always comes a point where you have that 1 gigabyte too much data, or, you know, 1 CPU too much being utilized, where you need to buy more, and you can't scale that in the same way that you can in cloud, where you can buy exactly what you need, and that's really where you're going to see the benefits. So having, you know, dipping your toes in the water with something like DR as a service, whatever it might be, that's always a good first step.
So one of the things that we always talk about is, what's the advantage of going to the cloud? And one of the questions that someone asked during the registration process was, why wouldn't I do this? Like, what are some of the disadvantages? And I think one of them we just talked about was potentially surprise cost. It was more costly than we expected it to be. Curtis, let's start with you on this one. What do you think are some reasons that organizations shouldn't consider moving to the cloud in some cases?
Well, I think the first one would potentially be cost, right? So if you do a lift and shift, and you just take a random application and you just move the VMs from your on-premises environment to the cloud, it is almost assuredly going to cost you more, right? So you need other reasons to do that, right? So that would be a disadvantage. Others could be physics, right? So depending on what you're doing with the data that you're doing, I think, for example, a video editing shop, if they put all their data up in the cloud, pulling it back down to do video editing might be problematic unless their video editing software is up in the cloud, right? So there's physics can sometimes get in your way as well.
Steve.
I think control is another big one. Obviously, when you've got your own kit on premises, you've got a lot of control over that. What you can do, some of that control is lost. Obviously, being on a shared platform and you know, utilizing, I guess, what's there for you. So that can be one of the I guess, challenges. I mean, Sazzala talked about VMware on AWS. You know, there's some limitations with VMware on AWS that you don't have if you're running VMware on premises. So, you know, there's things to consider around control as well, and whether that suits you, whether that's compliance, you know, anything you have around regulation, those sorts of things should also be considered.
Sazzala, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so the biggest thing I feel is that it'll be locked into the cloud. So if you just convert your VMs and do a bunch of work to actually, you know, use various techniques and APIs, you know, all these cloud companies have a lot of rich APIs. If you start using them and start, you know, integrating the kind of quite tightly, because you write scripts, whatever, that's it. You're not moving anywhere, right? That's going to be significantly, like, you know, limiting in what you do next. If tomorrow Amazon is in your business, which could be, then what do you do next? You have to kind of figure out then what I'm going to move from there. Like, I mean, besides the things people said, like cost, there's cost, of course. Cost is a minimum thing. You have to pass the bar. that it has to be somewhat make sense to you. But besides that, you have to consider, am I going to get locked into the one cloud?
Yeah, so I think cost has been a topic we've been talking about. I think you need to look at the short-term and the long-term cost projections for utilizing cloud. But I think one thing I'd say, obviously we work for a cloud company at Iland. Not all clouds are built equal in terms of how the pricing models work. Obviously, a lot of the time, the hyperscale providers generally focus around instance sizes. And when you take the VMware concept of resource pools and then move those virtual machines across, then you can get maybe higher costs as a result of those misshapen instances to align to what you have running. I think where we take a different approach is that we tend to do the cost analysis up front in the design phase. So we tend to look at utilization of resources in the customer's environment and actually work together to understand what are we going to move to the cloud, what's being used, and can we size those workloads before we move them? And then when we do run them, can we provide a model that actually is based purely on consumption of the underlying resources? So that's the approach that we take. I would also agree that control is essential, transparency. Obviously, you want to have the same level of visibility that you would have in your current environment. That's something that we believe in from our side. And I think one of the core elements I'd like to throw back as well is availability. So a lot of maybe the people on the line are running VMware-based environments. They're used to things like high availability being built on the underlying platform. When you move to other cloud environments, that concept isn't there. It's a build for failure-based approach. So I think it's about identifying the cloud that works for you for availability and making sure that that's considered with your applications that you're looking to run as well.
Well, we have some questions from the audience that we're going to take in just a couple of minutes, but I want to go on to our next question first. And the question we have here is, I think it goes back to, we may have actually already answered this, but maybe we can just quickly go over it again. The question is, does it make sense to lift and shift workloads? And what that means is basically, moving the VMs to the cloud as is for all intents and purposes. Or is it better for a cloud migration if you re-architect the environment to better fit a more native model of cloud? So rather than, I think it's going to be workload dependent. Obviously, if you have a client-server application that's latency sensitive, dumping the server in the cloud is a tremendously bad idea. But does anybody have any thoughts on this answer? And I'll just let somebody jump in.
Yeah, I mean,
doing both of these, they're doing lift and shift, especially if I think VMware Cloud being there, I think it maybe makes more sense to do lift and shift because for changing your existing applications. But I think you're going to build new applications. But if I see, like, if I go to Bank of America, they're writing brand new applications only for the cloud. That's how the model is going to be.
I would agree with that. Sorry, Steve, I was just going to say I would agree with that approach. That obviously, if you're building a new application and you have maybe services that are in the market that would help you build that new way of doing things, then I think it makes sense to build out fresh and take advantage of maybe some of those technologies. But really, if the core reason for moving to the cloud are things like flexibility, global reach, support services, those types of things, it makes sense to lift and shift. If you're a VMware-based user or a user of a certain platform, to lift and shift those workloads across to a cloud that's running that same technology, because then you can benefit from your overall things that you're looking for, but you don't have to re-architect the wheel to get to that point. You can lift and shift with technologies like Zerto, which we heavily use to move workloads between VMware clouds, for example.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to, I guess, what Sam said there. Obviously, at Zerto, we're able to move data with minimal downtime, just a few minutes between various platforms. And I guess what that can help you do is actually simplify any migration you're doing. Your end goal might be to re-architect and use elements within the cloud, but actually getting your data into that cloud platform first is often the best step. As soon as you start moving data and re-architecting at the same time, you're adding additional complexity that's going to add additional risk. And it's about minimizing that and ultimately the impact on the business.
Yeah, I see. My personal opinion is that lift and shift is a temporary fix. It's if for some reason you have to get into the cloud, it's the way to do it. But it introduces additional problems. You know how things operate on premises. You don't necessarily know how they're going to operate in the cloud. They could be much more costly because they're running 24/7 when they don't have to. And you also end up with potential latency issues in client-server applications, things like that. But I think that the lift to get companies to build cloud-native applications is tremendously high, especially if you look at some of the operations. I mean, if you look at some of the, we're still running COBOL. I mean, and mainframes and things like that. It's going to be decades before we have every application that's cloud native, right? So it's in some ways, it's almost unavoidable to get some element of lift and shift probably for now. And Curtis, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll take a somewhat contrarian approach to the other three panelists with respect. I agree that it's probably easier to do lift and shift. And for some workloads, it's the only way to get into the cloud. But I would also argue that designing for the cloud and designing the way the cloud works is sort of the proper way to leverage a lot of what the cloud has, right? So if you have an application that by itself can scale up and scale down throughout the day, the number of VMs that it uses or the amount of storage that it uses, if it can scale up and scale down, I think of a company like Intuit, where they have this gigantic demand for 3 days a year, right? From April 13th to April 15th, that they get half of their workloads at that time. So if they can architect their solution to automatically scale up to 10,000 VMs for those 3 days, but then scale down, they would get a massive benefit from doing that. Yes, Steve is right that there's risk to doing that. There's development costs to doing that. But I think long-term, fully leveraging the cloud and getting costs back down, the only way to do that is to architect to the cloud.
Okay. Does anybody completely disagree with that?
I mean, I'd agree with what Curtis has just said. I mean, the key thing is having your data already in the cloud makes it much quicker when you're moving that data into whatever the new architecture platform is. If you're moving that in from on-premises, you then having likely a large migration window, impact to business, etc. So I'd still say let's move it in.
I think, again, it all comes down to what's the objective, what's the business outcome, what's the technical outcome. Obviously, these moves to re-architect may make sense from a business and a technical perspective, but do you have the skills in-house, the time, those pieces? And maybe, again, the lift and shift approach may be a temporary thing to enable you to get to that point later on, or maybe the best approach for your specific applications because of the business outcomes that you're looking to achieve. Again, say, for example, you just take a lift and shift to a VMware-based cloud. With Iland, for example, your objective might be to go into new markets, maybe into Asia, into Australia, for example. That, again, allows you to do that with a cloud like us, with keeping the application consistent with the technology that you're used to using. So I think it really depends on the outcome from my side.
Let's move on to the next question. So one of the things that I think that if we've been in IT for any length of time, that we've probably heard from someone somewhere is, if you're in the cloud, you don't have to protect your data anymore. Like if you move to Office 365, you don't have to back that up anymore. I personally don't necessarily believe this, but let's start with Steve. What kinds of data protection capabilities will I need as I transition to the cloud?
So there's a few ways you can look at this. Obviously, you can architect your application to a way where you have data protection built in. That can get complex, costly, add its own risks. The easiest way is to ensure that you have a tool that's able to provide that protection. One of the key things is when you adopt one of these platforms is making sure, and Sazzala touched on this earlier, making sure you don't have that lock-in, and ultimately by having a tool that actually can deliver that protection across multiple platforms, your multi-cloud strategies, your hybrid cloud strategies, that's going to give you the best outcome, because at the end of the day, there's still hardware somewhere in a data center and it can fail. Yes, they're on a larger scale, but hardware is still hardware.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we talked about multi-cloud, hybrid cloud before. I think from our side, you almost need a holistic data protection strategy that takes care of wherever your data sits. You might be using software as a service solutions like Office 365. Like you mentioned, Microsoft takes care of the infrastructure and the availability of the service, but doesn't take care of the actual retention policy and the backup process as well. So that's where solutions like Office 365 backup solutions, such as the ones we offer, allow you to take care of that specific piece. But if you think about other cloud environments, you need a whole strategy around that, including backup, for example, you need to make sure that you're backing up locally in that specific location. You're getting the data off-site, you're storing it in different media types, really to avoid the pitfalls there. And I think using solutions like Zerto, for example, to do disaster recovery services between facilities is not only giving the ability to bring that application up, but also allowing you to get back in time to a point that's going to be useful for the business. So I think it's having an entire approach that's covering whatever platform you're on and encompassing not only data protection and backup, but also the recovery aspect. I think you need an overall approach for that.
Curtis?
Yeah, obviously I agree. What I would say is, if I could just change the word, what kind of data protection needs will I have as I transition to the cloud? And I would argue that your needs shouldn't change, right? So if people, they've moved into Office 365, you still have a need to protect that data, right? The methods that you use to protect it, I think that, and again, I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy, but we have to go back to data protection fundamentals, things like the 3-2-1 rule, right? That we had to come up with, 20 years ago to help make sense of things. But when you see somebody that says, well, Office 365 knows how to protect itself, and it does to a certain degree, but it's a basic violation of the 3-2-1 rule. You're storing the thing you're protecting inside the thing you're protecting. So it's got to be put somewhere else, right? So if you look at Amazon native protection, which is good, right? So you have built-in Amazon protection within that. But for example, that data, like the EC2, the EBS snapshots, I don't think they should be stored in your Amazon account. They should be copied to at least another Amazon account, and hopefully in another region, right? So you have to keep applying these same standards no matter what solution you're looking at. You need to make sure that you're protecting against the loss of the entire environment itself. You need to protect against the loss of the, not just the, let's say in the case of Office 365 going down, but a region, like in the case of Amazon, or maybe Amazon itself isn't down, but their region is down. You need to protect against, need to protect against all the same things we had to protect against back in the day. They haven't gone away just because you moved into the cloud. And it's just how you're going to do those is what's going to change.
Sazzala.
Yeah, so there is the old way, which is the 3-2-1 and some of the old application way of doing it. There is the new way, which if you look at some of the applications, the newer applications, like, which is the cloud native applications, they kind of are able to do a lot of things by themselves in a built-in. And most people do DR replication to other regions so that they have high availability. If you go to any SaaS company now, that's how they do it. They don't even know what the words backup and DR mean anymore. It seems like it's a very old word of looking at it. So it's a good question, but if you go to any SaaS company now, that's not how they think about it. They are thinking about it as a application level strategy. They think of multi-cloud as an application level strategy, but nevertheless, there's still a lot of applications which are not like that. And I think for that, I agree with some of the other panelists here that you need a bigger picture view of how I can manage my data protection strategies in a cost-efficient way, because people don't want to ultimately pay for backup. I've been in the business. Before this, I was a data domain and before Datrium. So I kind of know that people they have a budget and they don't want to spend tons of dollars for it, but it's a necessity. And how do you do this in a multi-cloud way, in a hybrid cloud way, that you have a global view of all the data you can protect properly?
So it brings us to our next question, which is actually an interesting one. I'm going to start with you, Curtis. What kinds of data protection opportunities can I see as I transition to the cloud? I mean, what are some of the things that might be enabled by a migration to the cloud?
Well, I think when we talk about VMs, right, it's sort of that sort of strategy. So because if we're looking at SaaS applications like Salesforce or Office 365, it's very different. You don't really get any new capabilities, I don't think. But when you transition to the cloud with VMs, there are some huge opportunities. We talked about DRaaS being one of them, probably the biggest one, is that you have all this infrastructure to be able to easily recover a VM to another area or a volume to another region or even to another provider if you have a multi-cloud data protection solution, right? So I think that's the easy one to answer, is that there are a lot of recovery options that are available to you because the cloud has so much capability.
Sazzala.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned it a little bit.
Yes. So, every cloud vendor is going to have some backup capabilities themselves. Like, Amazon recently announced their backup lifecycle manager, which kind of does backups of because it's not just about EBS. There's also database services. There's a bunch of services now, like Kafka services. So you need specific, integration with that. Before with VMware, it was all VMs, all VMDKs. It was easy to do everything. But now it's like different services, and backup vendors can't keep up with that stuff. Every cloud has so many new services. So some people are definitely going to choose the Amazon way. If you're going to be in Amazon, you've decided that they're going to just click the button on the UI to say, Amazon, back up my stuff. And that's how it's going to be for some people. But some people are afraid of Amazon and they want to be in a multi-cloud place. I think there's an opportunity for a lot of vendors to innovate in that space and kind of make it sophisticated. So it's like a backup service. It's a global backup service so that you can back up anywhere you want to, from any place to any place. I think it's going to happen. People will see more of this in the I think, upcoming years.
And what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, so obviously on our side, we do provide backup services. It's akin to the option that you just mentioned there, where you're running virtual machines on our platform. You can take advantage of core platform level services that inherently provide backup. That's both at the local location and the ability to offsite that in any of the global locations that we have. The same again for disaster recovery. And I think where this is really nice is a lot of the disaster recovery solutions also allow you to pick and choose the workloads that you wish to protect. Maybe you don't need to protect everything. It can be an approach where you do it on a modular basis across maybe tier 1 applications. So really, I think it's really, exposing disaster recovery and backup technologies to the wider market and allowing them to consume it as a service. But one thing I'd also say, which is maybe slightly different to this question, but as you add technologies like disaster recovery as a service that allow you to test non-intrusively at any point in time, you have a live copy of your production environment. So I believe that data protection now is not just data protection. You have a lot of added value on top, things like being able to do security assessments on a copy of your production environment, being able to do UAT testing and test dev on a live copy of your production environment on another site. So I think that just expands what you can do on top of the overall data protection that you're looking for.
Steve.
Yeah, three guys just made some very good points. I think, the scale and flexibility that we talked about previously, Curtis mentioned it initially, that's really beneficial, especially for the likes of DR and backup, where you're only paying for what you use. And the OpEx billing model ultimately comes into that. Each cloud platform has their own way of doing that, different levels of granularity, etc. But I guess, having, and this is what Sazzala was getting at, a single tool that's going to provide you data protection across all of your platforms and ultimately deliver on your strategy around multi-cloud, hybrid cloud is going to be key. A lot of these vendors have their own capabilities. You look at, AWS have just bought Cloud Endure. I'm sure they're going to do some stuff with that. You look at Azure with ASR. But the key thing with all of these tools is the providers in those instances really don't want people to leave their platform. And so those tools are aimed at getting data into their platform, protecting it across their platform. But if you want that resiliency across multiple clouds or multiple platforms, or to be able to get your data out to those platforms, you really need to have a tool that's able to provide that agnostic approach. So yeah, I mean, that's the way I'd be looking at it from that perspective.
So I'm going to take there's a series of questions that come from the audience, and they're all similar in scope. So I'm not going to use one of the PowerPoint slides right now. So give me a second here to make sure. Let me read the 3 questions because they're similar, and then we'll just react to them. Is that okay?
Good.
So the first one says, we're an educational institution, and we have a real concern about taking our research groups and projects data to the cloud. What can you say about what we can tell teachers about security and confidentiality? That's the first question around data security, data sensitivity. The next one is, what is your stance on moving to the cloud for sensitive data? What's your approach to minimize your footprint in the cloud from a security and privacy perspective? And the third one is related, and it's how do you deal with multinational customers where they have a presence in countries that have more restrictive laws and data location, data sovereignty rules? So we have a combination, we have 3 similar concerns around data as far as data protection, data security, and data sovereignty goes. Sazzala, what are your thoughts on this whole issue of data sensitivity and security in the cloud?
Actually, so I have 2-3 thoughts. One is that, but the first one was that, the data security problem, it's no matter where you are, that problem remains. I think in some degree, it's ransomware. How does ransomware come into your environment? It's just because somebody did something. So that problem doesn't go away fundamentally, I think, from one place to the other. But some things do go away. For example, the denial of service attacks, things like that. Probably the cloud guys are better at this because they kind of have a lot of engineers. They have the most engineers working on this stuff than anybody else. So I think in some ways the cloud is better. In other ways, it's a little weaker in the sense that you may be able to open up some of your S3 buckets and somebody may access them. That's danger. But I think fundamentally, I don't think the cloud is more dangerous than I think your on-prem. I'm not sure I agree with that. The other one about how do I get the compliance within different countries? Actually, SaaS companies now, I think they're able to take advantage of that. Before, a company like let's say Salesforce or maybe like something like that, you have to deploy your box, your systems in every country to do GDPR and everything else. But now Amazon or Azure is in every country in some sense, and you can just deploy your services. So the advantage of a SaaS company now is that they can deploy and still follow the rules in these different countries. It's a speed up business.
Steve, what are your thoughts on those questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think these cloud platforms are huge, and because of that, you get the benefit of scale. That ultimately means that they can have that enterprise class hardware. Sazzala talked about DDoS. That's a perfect example. They're going to have hardware in there that would be completely out of your budget if you were running on premises. So you're going to see a lot of benefits from things like that. But the same aspects still remain in that you have to take some responsibility yourself to make sure default firewall rules or whatever it is are configured to suit your needs. It's not put it in the cloud and it's instantly secure. And I guess the last thing I just wanted to touch on that was around compliance. And every cloud is different from this perspective. So it's making sure you understand your requirements from that perspective and therefore where you fit best from a cloud platform perspective. Because there are, these large public cloud platforms and they have, sub clouds within them that may be specific to certain, regulation or whatever. And then you might have some that actually focused on that as an outright and are able to deliver you better outcomes from a security perspective to suit your needs. So really it's about making sure you're doing your homework from that perspective.
Curtis?
My opinion for a long time has been that the security of the average cloud, like hyperscaler, my opinion is that the security of that average cloud is better than the security of the average data center, right? Just that on average, just like what Sazzala was talking about, that on average they have this huge environment, and people reference these things like these open S3 buckets and stuff, but that was somebody, you could do the same thing with an NFS server that you put on the internet, right? That I do think that the cloud makes it's like I used to say, like if you use replication as a backup mechanism and you get a virus, it just makes the virus more effective, right? With using the cloud, if you do something stupid, like creating a bucket, an S3 bucket with no authentication, it's just going to make your stupidity more effective. But you could have done the same thing in your environment, right? But I think just generally speaking, the security protecting your overall environment is better in the public cloud. And then just when you have to put the same controls in place that you had in a data center, you have to put those in the cloud as well. And don't blame that on, don't blame your open S3 bucket on Amazon.
So the last one I read that was that most of the data breaches you see these days, it happens because of some phishing expedition. And that could be anywhere. I mean, that's the main things you see for many of these breaches.
Yeah, that's where the ease of the cloud comes in there. Because it's so easy, quite often people just overlook these things. And that's where you end up with these hiccups. Either that or the IT team themselves aren't actually involved in that deployment and someone's just gone ahead and done it. And that, you get your whole shadow IT from that perspective, and that can create a whole level of problems.
Dan, do you have thoughts here?
Yeah, I would agree with Curtis. I think for me, one of the top concerns when we actually surveyed the market was security and compliance. We understand that that's a concern, but I would agree that most clouds, including places like Iland, are really, I think, going beyond what they would traditionally have on premises. And the really nice thing around this conversation as well, when we're thinking about migrations, is we've always encouraged you to test before you actually take the leap. I think where the confusion comes is often, I think in the past, there hasn't been the levels of transparency and visibility compared to what you have locally. So that actually starts building that picture that maybe it isn't as secure and compliant as you're doing today. Where we take the approach is we want to be as transparent and visible as possible to a customer, expose all of the information that they would typically see. And I think that builds a lot of trust when you do that. It allows them to audit and see what the current status of a service is. Curtis mentioned obviously S3 buckets. You really want something where you have visibility over what permissions have been allocated to a service, and also seeing all of the audit trailing and elements behind the scenes so you can ensure that you can validate that at all times. I would also say data sovereignty continues to become top of mind with a lot of organizations. Really, I think cloud really enables that very well, because there's a huge plethora of choice of where you deploy globally, and you can really align where you deploy that service to the requirements that you have. I think there's a great deal of choice there. I think that's extremely important. I think where I would urge caution is certain services may move applications between regions, and those regions may cross geographical bounds. I think that's a really key element to consider where you're housing the data and ensuring you have an agreement with that provider to ensure that that stays in that region. That's critical to the types of industries that we work with on a daily basis, things like pharmaceuticals, healthcare, and education, as we mentioned before.
So the next question we have is a really important one, and I think it's probably the one that is the least understood sometimes, and it's, what are some of the cost considerations that I need to keep in mind as I consider the differences between on-premises, hybrid/multi-cloud, and other public cloud type things? Sam, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think we touched on this before. So I think when you look towards the hyperscale and the public cloud, they all adopt the model of an instance-based approach, where you have to, maybe if we're lifting and shifting workloads, you may have machines that maybe have a certain allocation of CPU, RAM, and storage on premises, but you can't get that exact match within the public cloud. And you're often maybe overpaying for resources that you're not actually going to consume. So I think it's twofold. It's first of all, when you're going to be moving to the cloud, identifying, is my allocated set of resources to that machine actually what I need, first of all? But also, can I move to a cloud where they don't take an approach which is around a library of instance sizes, and actually, in fact, allow me to move what I have and actually move the cost element to what's actually being consumed and what the resource pool needs are to run that application. So it's kind of a different approach. That's the way we take it. And I think that's where costs start to extrapolate when you're kind of having to align the building blocks to what the public cloud providers are offering in the market.
Steve?
Yeah, no, I think Sam's absolutely right. You know, every provider out there, every cloud platform out there has its own billing model, and that's done at different levels of granularity. I know Iland have a very granular offering. I guess understanding that is one of the key aspects. And in order to do that, you need to understand what you're moving into these platforms. Once you understand that, then suddenly you can start making decisions around what's viable to move into these platforms. Where am I going to save costs, and where is it actually going to increase costs? You know, Curtis touched before.
I think you just said something really important, and that is you have to know what you're moving into the platforms. And I really do believe there are a lot of organizations that don't truly and fundamentally understand their workload, performance behaviors.
I would also, if I can, just add as well, there's a lot of different cost elements that you maybe have to consider with different types of clouds, things like bandwidth, for example, transactions, I/O, those types of things can add up. And I think you need to take the approach of actually considering what does that actually look like before you move in, and also not just taking the bare infrastructure costs or the actual resources themselves, but what services do I need to add on that aren't included in this? Things like support, for example. Those things are things that you need, but you need to consider overall with the rest of the actual underlying technology itself.
Curtis, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that multi-cloud, multi-cloud is the new multi-vendor, right? So we don't want to be locked into Amazon, or we don't want to be locked into Azure, and so we use both. And I think that you just need to recognize that basically you're going to be playing a balancing game between cost and risk, right? So if the risk you're trying to mitigate is I don't want to be locked into both, okay, well, then let's go back to data protection. Well, that means that you need to use a non-native data protection solution to get the data out of both of them into something that can recover into either of them. And what I'm going to tell you is that's going to be expensive as something. And that is, we will totally mitigate the risk of being locked in, but then you're going to have a huge cost, not just of having that central copy, but all the cost of moving data in and out of those, because they don't, I forgot who it was said it earlier, they incentivize you to keep the data in their platform. They don't want you to back it up. We're happy to back up from Azure and to back up from Amazon if that's what you want us to do. But just realize you're going to be paying egress charges when you move that data in and out. It's cheaper to use their native data protection solutions, which then ties you to them from a recovery standpoint. So and of course, the more multi-clouds you do, the more APIs you need to learn, right? It's just like back in the day when we wanted to have Solaris and AIX. Well, that means you needed to know 2 Unixes and to be proficient at both of them. Now you need to be proficient at Azure and at Amazon and at Google and at Iland, right? Multi-cloud, I think it's one of those things that sounds great, but just realize it's probably going to be more expensive than not multi-cloud.
Sazzala, what are your thoughts on the cloud cost question?
Yeah, so I'm going to go a little bit like maybe lower level than I think the discussion. On-prem, we are used to this model of having, some amount of flash, some amount of store, like hard drives, and being able to do dedupe and compression and get the benefits. You get high performance, but you also get dedupe and compression to basically cut your costs. So let's say you get 5x of dedupe and compression. Now, if you take that to the cloud is not going to give you any dedupe and compression. That's how it operates. So suddenly your 100 terabytes of data, which is kind of living on your on-prem, has become half a petabyte. Now that half a petabyte is a fundamental. First of all, cloud is expensive. You go from a CapEx model to an OpEx model, and you'll see that the 5x storage is just going to be eating, right there is going to be a bill you have to think about, consider that. And also, even if you do backup, like of all these things, then that's the other problem is that are you doing backup to EBS or are you doing backup to S3? So fundamentally, if you don't use S3 and do dedupe and compression and some of those things, I think you're gonna have a huge bills you're gonna have to end up paying just for the storage. And there's the other cost of, like I think Sam mentioned, the compute, how it's not very easy to kind of do bin packing. So those are the 2 things. I think the storage is going to be, because without those features, you're going to suddenly realize the bills. That's just and then.
I was just going to also add, obviously, as you maybe do span multiple environments and multiple services, how do you get a single view across the billing within those platforms? How easy it is for the people interested in the cost elements to actually consume that and see the trends over time? I think that's a really important piece that you need to make sure that you are not only kind of progressing the cost and understanding what this cost is going to be, but also having kind of almost real-time and historical billing that you can refer back to and also attribute to specific projects and business units. So I think cost and cost transparency is extremely important from my side.
Yeah, I think that ease of use makes that even more prevalent, right? You end up with a sprawl because people can spin things up a lot quicker. Maybe they're not so good at bringing things back down when they're finished being used.
We are getting close on time. I'm going to move to our next question. And that question is, if you had to, let's just think with one, what's the biggest mistake you see each individually, and we'll keep this quick, organizations make if they move into, as they consider cloud adoption for workloads? And let's start with Sazzala on this one.
Yeah, I've seen this multiple times, and I've seen people get fired also. It's mostly because they have not really thought about the consequences, the cost, risk, and skill sets you need to actually migrate to the cloud. And sometimes it's just cool because the CIO said so, because it's like that sounds like the latest thing. You go to any conference now, VMworld, whatever, cloud is a thing. So everybody thinks we should do it, and then they pay the price once they do it. So I think having that logic about going back to the 3 things businesses care about, everybody should care about is, does it increase my speed of business? Does it fit my budget? And does it reduce my risk? Those are the 3 things people care about. If you skip any of those, you're going to be paying the price. You get fired, and then you'll basically be bringing it all back to on-prem.
Sam.
I would say cost is a big one. I think availability and the just inherent availability of a platform is something to consider, and not all clouds are built equal in that way. I would also say compatibility is a massive one for me. Obviously, organizations in the ideal world would maybe be entirely virtualized, but over time, obviously, legacy applications develop, maybe legacy operating systems, applications, physical components, things like that, as well as obviously the security and the networking side. So I think it's about assessing your workload from a compatibility perspective up front against the capabilities of the cloud you're moving to, because often there are components that are essential to your application that may not work on those platforms, that you may need to upgrade or change to make compatible with those. So I think doing a lot of design work, I'm a previous pre-sales engineer. We built a tool to actually analyze customers' environments, but we really want to spend a great deal of time from our side ensuring that we look at the customer's entire application set and understanding if there's a certain element that may need re-architectures to actually move into the cloud. So I think compatibility and looking at the cloud's capabilities is essential, I think, from my side.
Steve?
I think understanding, guys have touched on this, your environment is key, but also understanding your capabilities in-house, and Sazzala mentioned that as well. Depending on which cloud platform you go to, Sam's talked about some of Iland's offerings there and what they do to assist in those scenarios. If you look at the bigger cloud providers, you're probably not going to get those supports, particularly if you're a smaller vendor. In those scenarios, you're going to be responsible for sizing. You're going to be responsible for understanding what's going on in your environment, what you need to deploy, and ultimately what the cost is going to be once it's in there. We've talked about people assuming that moving everything to the cloud is going to be cheaper. Hopefully we've made that clear that's not the case. And it's really down to understanding what it is that you're moving and what your workloads are doing in order to get the most out of the cloud.
Curtis?
Yeah, again, I'm going to say nothing's new under the sun. One of the common mistakes is people, when they use a new platform, whether it's a cloud service provider or a SaaS solution, and that is, somebody forgets how to back it up, right? So that's one of the things they do is say, hey, Salesforce sounds awesome. Let's move all our stuff into Salesforce. And the question is that data being protected? And so, again, I'm going to sound like a fuddy-duddy. That part hasn't changed. It's not going to change. Data still needs to be protected wherever it goes. And people get excited about a new offering, and they move into that offering without making sure they understand how that data is being protected.
All right, let's move on to our next question. And that is, how can organizations, well, let's skip this one because I think we've talked about that a bit. They basically be careful is what it boils down to. This is almost, this was a question that came in from the audience. And the question is, how much of this is hype and how much of this is reality? And Steve, let's start with you on this one.
So absolutely it can. But again, it comes back to making sure it's appropriate. There's loads of benefits utilizing a cloud platform infrastructure that previously you've managed, you're no longer needing to manage. Your IT teams can focus on innovation. So there's a lot of benefits, but you've got to make sure you're understanding, whether it's going to benefit all of your workloads, which I suspect it wouldn't. And then obviously in that scenario, you're then going to have that mix of architecture, hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, having a capability to ensure you can move workloads around to get the most out of that strategy is key. A lot of people will place their workloads based on day one requirements across their various platforms. Actually, those requirements will change. We all know they do. Having a tool that helps them move between these workloads as and when they need to with minimal impact to the business is essential to getting the most out of these strategies. And that's one of the key things that Zerto is able to provide by removing locking to any of these platforms.
Dan, what are your thoughts on this hype versus reality thing?
Yeah, I would say, again, like Steve mentioned, it really is about what you're trying to solve, and is what you're moving to going to give you an order of magnitude greater service or greater availability or greater scalability, all those types of things compared to what you do today. And I think if you move production applications to the cloud, it all becomes around the networking capabilities of the cloud as well. How are you going to connect to it? Is the latency and the experience good? And can your application be served from a remote location? I think those are the keys. I would say that where I think the reality does come into play around replacing a data center from our side is we're always encountering customers now who have second data center locations today for disaster recovery. And I think where it really makes a great deal of sense to consider any cloud environment is for a disaster recovery use case, because that's allowing you either to repurpose or shut down that second data center and take advantage of a location where really you're only paying for storage and you're paying for CPU and memory on demand in the rare use case where you actually have to have a disaster recovery event or a test. And so that really has a huge cost saving to a business, which is huge business value, I think. So I think that's complete reality. And I think if you are doing disaster recovery to a second data center today, it really is probably time to look at something like a DR as a service offering, utilizing Zerto or another cloud provider or Iland, for example. It really is a huge cost saving, and it makes complete sense from a business value perspective as well.
Sazzala.
Yeah, so it's a matter of when, as opposed to like if. If you just look at the graphs on the growth of the cloud services, I think it tells the story by itself a little bit. But I think it's going to take a time. It's going to take a while before the data centers completely get off this. I mean, I think it's going to be just a matter of when. I think until then, it's still. I think the DR is a pretty powerful story to the cloud. It's a pretty powerful story in the sense that you can get rid of your second data center. That's going to happen much faster than anything we have seen, I think, happening. Because that is a total cost center, second data center. If you can make that easy, efficient, and cut costs on the DR, that's a huge win. So I think half the data centers will go away because of that.
Curtis.
I think that a lot of data centers will go away. I think that there will still be a lot of companies, specifically larger companies, that will find it they still can do it less expensive, and they can still do it efficiently enough to have their own data center. I totally agree with the getting rid of the second data center. That's a perfect use of the cloud. But I think that a lot of companies will try the cloud, and if they don't re-architect and they just do a full lift and shift, they'll find that it's just way more expensive in the cloud. If they're okay with that, that's fine. But I think a lot of companies will try that and will still find themselves back in a data center of some sort.
All right, gentlemen, that is all the time we have. Thank you all. I wish we didn't get through all of our questions, but we now have a lot of blog post fodder, it sounds like, for lots of the rest of the questions. Thank you all for joining us today, Sam, Steve, Curtis, and Sazzala. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And we have 3 gift cards we'll be giving away, 3 $100 Amazon gift cards. Our winners are Brenda Lewin, Chris Austin, and Mike Carter. Will be reaching out to you after today's event with information on how to collect your gift cards. And to our panelists, once again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And everyone, please have a great rest of your day. Thanks.